At the time of writing, I am 25 years old. My birthday was months ago, and the fact that I am now closer to 30 than 20 is still terrifying. I've played video games for at least 20 of those years, and my adolescence was dominated by the likes of Call of Duty, with the occasional Dynasty Warriors here and there. It wasn't until I started college at 16 when I started branching out my tastes, the revelation that I may be missing something hitting me when Minecraft was starting its meteoric rise. Even so, I still restricted myself to some degree, only going through games that are much older than I am fairly recently, with the exception of ET. Going through games that are older than you can be an interesting journey. It reminds you how fast the technology, both gameplay and visuals, has progressed within your lifespan. And going through some of the oldest in a series is fascinating due to how their recent installments have adapted to new standards. You can see Final Fantasy completely transform its gameplay structure before your very eyes. You can see Tetris self-destruct, and you can see how old the Elite series really is. But the most fascinating of these old games is one from 1981. It's an early stealth game that really shows its age, with the objective being to steal war plans and escape the castle. What's really interesting about this game is that the name of the title is Castle Wolfenstein, and the game would be the first of many that would carry the Wolfenstein name, a series that has defined a company, a genre, and undergone 3 different transformations leading to its current rendition. Generalizing Wolfenstein is hard because the tone of the games changed decade by decade. The 80s first defining the name through stealth mechanics, the 90s launching id Software as the must-watch developer after the original IP rights collapsed, the 2000s as a forgettable era responsible for one of the best zero punctuation episodes ever produced, and the 2010s reigniting the brand and turning BJ Blazkowicz from a player insert to one of the best written characters in gaming. I'm not alone in saying that Blazkowicz's character transformation was nothing short of monumental, because it was one of the rare times where adding character traits and flaws to an iconic character worked to a game's benefit. It would be like if the transformation of Lara Croft in the 2013 reboot worked as well as the target audience and developers wanted, or if the developers changed Duke Nukem from a reference testosterone machine to a tired, self-doubting war hero with complexities. Because that's what happened to Wolfenstein. BJ Blazkowicz became a complex and at times relatable character, with lifestyle tastes, relationships, and flaws. And today I want to talk about the transformation of Blazkowicz after World War II, going from iconic war hero to a revolutionary fighting for his own desires. It's hard to imagine Blazko beyond the traditional American hero archetype. His appearance in the 2009 game is barely recognizable from how he is today. In fact, you would be forgiven for saying he was the blandest of American heroes in all of media back then. He's the greatest soldier in the world who kills Nazis and sabotages their work, by extension saving the world. I could talk about where the character itself was after the less inspired 2009 entry, but as I've alluded before, that iteration of the character is just not very interesting to talk about. He has no layers to his character, no nuance. He's just the best soldier in the world who can single-handedly infiltrate Nazi fortresses like a swashbuckling action hero. You would have thought that he would have something to say after coming across Nazi sorcerers and experiencing the effects of a magical medallion. And to really hammer this point home, the game's indecisiveness of Blazkowicz being silent or not means that's the first time we hear him after seeing the effects of the medallion MacGuffin comes sometime later after destroying Nazi machinery, in which he says this.
What in the hell?
Granted, he was a silent protagonist before 2009, but the voiceover added zero benefit to the character or gameplay. He rarely talked, and when he did, it was generic lines from what was then a generic character. So adding character to a macho American hero was something that a writer with any degree of planning would succeed at, but Machine Games not only acknowledges the image Blazkowicz has before their audience presses the new game selection, but makes an attempt to add personality and flaws to a previously bare-bones model. Not only do they succeed in their mission, but they went beyond the call of duty, something that becomes evident in the first 10 seconds of the game.
In my dream, I smell the barbecue. I hear children.
There's a popular test in internet culture that's used to analyze character depth called the Plinkett test. It's commonly linked back to Red Letter Media's masterful review of Star Wars Episode 1, and it's thoroughly demonstrated how cardboard the Phantom Menace's characters were in comparison to the original trilogy. The test is simple. Simply describe a character without mentioning their physical appearance or job. The test is brilliant, but one thing it doesn't factor in is what the character is supposed to be in terms of execution. For example, let's take Heavy Rain's Madison Paige. Madison Paige is a dedicated woman, extremely resourceful, and very concerned. Her motivations for helping Ethan are a blend between personal interest and general unease. Throughout the game, she comes to understand Ethan, and the connection they have throughout his entire ordeal leads to potential romance. That's not me being snarky, that is Madison's character, and on its own it would be praised as such. But the execution of that character was horribly botched, leading to frustration with the narrative, and one sequence that made her come across as a bit sociopathic. The reason why I bring this up is because we need to acknowledge that BJ Blazkowicz in the New Order isn't just a single character, but two different people that flesh out one human being. You have the surface layer that's reinforced through gameplay, and the execution which involves Blazkowicz's inner thoughts. And if you want further evidence of that, try to imagine the game without the voiceover. I played the game without any of the dialogue playing, though unfortunately that option doesn't apply to the beautiful pre-rendered cutscenes, and what struck me was that aside from a few moments, Blazkowicz's dialogue operated in mostly the same way it did in Wolfenstein 2009. He doesn't talk during gameplay sections and only does so during pre-rendered cutscenes. Now, don't misconstrue this as saying that the New Order executes Blazkowicz's exterior on the same level as Wolfenstein 2009's. Even without the inner thoughts, the New Order is able to pull off some characterization. Thoughts or not, it's a step up from his previous incarnation, and I attribute a good amount to that to the masterful soundtrack by Mick Gordon. Mick had been an established composer in the game industry at that point, but Wolfenstein was the first game that I believe really started to showcase his insane talent, and I am confident that the New Order might be the best soundtrack Gordon has composed, simply because it was able to elicit emotion in a Wolfenstein game, something that is almost alien to the franchise. Even if Blazkowicz's inner thoughts were removed, the soundtrack would still elicit the appropriate emotion. And to give an example, let's look at arguably my favourite cutscene in the entire game.
You're inside. Now I put you in the car, we have to drive! Pedaling down Shit's Creek now, Johnny Cowboy. I hope we can make it back home on time.
Berlin. Come in, Berlin. What's your status?
We're in that ship, Captain. Hanging on, but don't know for how much longer. The Death's Heads men are everywhere.
I'm not alone in saying that between this, Prey, and especially Doom, Mick Gordon is one of the modern-day composing greats, rightfully placed alongside the likes of Martin O'Donnell, Akira Yamaoka, Michael McCann, and Harry Gregson Williams. So with that established, we have a character who, on the surface, is two-dimensional since he is still the archetypical American hero that everyone relies on to get the hardest of jobs done. Farm boy Texas strong, ambidextrous with guns, and an iconic freedom fighter, crippling concentration camps and moon bases, and whatever Nazi fortification is in the unfortunate position on getting in between his crosshairs. He's sometimes ignorant to situations, and he's sometimes a bit of an arrogant dick. He is the typical American hero. That is, until we start listening to his inner thoughts at the very start of the game, which gives this character a much darker and depressing undertone. It's easy to accuse a voiceover or audio logs of doing the vast majority of world building or characterization, but it would be hard to argue against what is a key part of BJ Blazkowicz's character. It was very strange at first to hear these frankly jarring thoughts set against what is a very silly setting. Robot dogs, giant tripod weapons, Nazis on the moon, and the core central character is someone who is very tired of it all. It would be easy to say that Blazkowicz is shell-shocked and exhausted from fighting the Nazis, and 1946 was really pushing his limits. The first moments we see of him, he's asleep and dreaming of a relaxing life. His thoughts while in gameplay evoke someone wrought with guilt over his failure to kill Deathsed, who was the main antagonist of the 2009 game, oddly. And so we end up with one of the most complex characters in modern day gaming. On the surface, he may be that hero that everyone looks up to, but now with his thoughts playing, we get additional context. No longer does his request to be directed to the Resistance come across as rushed and convenient for the gameplay. Now his request comes across as desperate and almost unsettling. Now this two-dimensional at best figure has transformed into a relatable tragic hero with complexities, who, more often than not, wants it to be over by any means necessary, to the point that he sounds like he's on almost accepting terms with death itself. He's pained and exhausted, but now he has to bear the responsibility of keeping the Kreisau Circle in high hopes. He has to live with his legendary reputation, despite his mental conditioning saying otherwise. But make no mistake, despite the misery Blazkowicz's thoughts convey, they are not all negative, and that is one key factor into Blazko's characterization. Without the thoughts, the first romance depiction of Blazkowicz and Anya would have been a jarring surprise, but with Blazkowicz's thoughts, it becomes a lot more personal, and adds more depth to his character. Don't get me wrong, I think the scene could have done with a much better build-up, especially since the cutscene follows one of the best character introductions of this generation, but what is there has enough to describe the very few moments of peace he has in this new world. In addition, we occasionally see a lighter side to his character, most notably during the submarine level, and the prolonged journey he makes to get a welder, followed by delivering a note to the other side of the room.
Actually, would you deliver this note to Anya? She will need the frequency of the transponder to track the thing.
Like I'm the goddamn errand boy.
His thoughts also add to the gameplay, which also goes hand in hand with the exterior personality. It's a trifecta of exterior appearance, inner thoughts, and gameplay mechanics, where each one reinforces the other, and as a result we have a game that's engaging for those who are story light, and deeply satisfying for those looking for deep character drama, especially since every other character is wonderfully constructed and complements either the story tropes or Blazkowicz himself. I previously said in another video that William J. Blazkowicz is personally the best representative of people with depression in video games, and while it's not going to be the same for everyone, I think the careful crafting of William's personality is an accurate depiction of the condition, hiding our real feelings and mental state possibly out of fear, because you don't want to suddenly become a burden, even if not doing so is self-destructive. I relish this game. It's possibly one of the best written games to come out of this generation so far that doesn't sacrifice or contradict its own game mechanics. And if you have any interest in character studies, The New Order is a must-play. While I did want a sequel in the sense that I want the overall story to continue, I don't mind the somber ending, a combination of great dialogue, phenomenal voice acting, and Mick Gordon's fantastic musical direction. I would have been fine with BJ's story ending here, but to everyone's surprise, William's story was to continue.
The old and the weak are doomed.
I recently called Wolfenstein 2 The New Colossus one of the best games of last year, and I stand by that, but I will admit that it's definitely weaker than The New Order, though part of that is down to just how fresh The New Order felt. The New Colossus was in a weird position of being a sequel to one of the biggest and most welcome surprises of the generation, but while I think that the story is a little bit weaker, the characters and their execution are still fantastic. The introduction of Horton was delightfully entertaining, the game continues to masterfully inject dark comedy at the right moments, and the development of BJ Blazkowicz continues to delight me. Previously, I said that Blazkowicz feels like he's on accepting terms with death itself, and that is an element that is amplified during the first half of this game. If there's anything this game does, it's validate a lot of things I had about the New Order. Which isn't to say that the themes and elements I mentioned in the New Order were purposely inserted. I could be seeing meaning where there is none, but the acceptance of death is expanded upon due to the fact that Blazkowicz feels like his life is on a countdown. This is something that plays very nicely into the way he interacts with people on Ava's hammer, as well as how he perceives himself. With death said gone, the guilt over his previous failure is gone with it, and to fill that void is the fact that it's likely he won't be around when his heavily pregnant partner gives birth to twins. Combined with his failure to rescue the last person from his past that he has respect towards, and you have a man whose circumstances mean that the burden he previously bore has only increased. Fractured leadership, his health in decline, the rebellion now more dependent on him, and his loved one now needing to rely on him more than ever. While it is a broad generalization of his character development, what makes this tone so well executed is not only the consistency of said tone, but two very specific moments. The New Colossus may be the weaker of the two games, but it delivers two of my favourite and most relatable cutscenes out of both games. The first is when Anya questions why William has been leaving her in the dark. His reason is simple, that he doesn't want to be a burden to Anya when she has her own problems. And that leads me back to a previous point I made about Blazkowicz, depression, and its connection to myself and many others. The reason why myself and many others are afraid to even speak to our closest friends and family members about how we feel is the fear that we'll become a burden. Speaking from personal experience, holding back the truth ended up being a fear of fear situation where the anxiety of being a bother to others was much worse than letting it out. I love this scene, because even though it's a sad reveal for two characters, it was a wonderful message whether intentional or not. Blazkowicz already has the legendary reputation to live up to in the last game, but with that amplified by a combination of Caroline's death, rising tensions, William's frail and dying state, and the prospect of leaving Anya to raise two children without him, his mental state could arguably get worse to the point that he actively, if briefly, avoids Anya to spare her the pain. He finally relents. Anya is initially upset with William before acknowledging his pain and encourages him to take a different mindset. While the cutscene ends with the outcome going either way, his first thoughts after that finalizes that positive message.
Well, Caroline, I fucked up and told her. Turns out, the hurt I tried to spare was mine, not hers.
This cutscene is arguably the only explicit showing of Blazkowicz's inner thoughts coming out to the surface, and had this cutscene been shown without William's thoughts on the prospect of leaving Anya behind, it would be one of the most jarring scenes in the entire game. Of course, we get the inner thoughts, and thus elevates the cutscene into something much more resonant. But there is one other cutscene that resonated with me personally, and while the scene I just analysed gave out a very positive message, this specific scene is one that demonstrated why William J. Blazkowicz is arguably one of the best written and complex characters currently going. After breaking out of restraints and killing a lot of Nazis, Blazkowicz goes through the back courtroom door to see his mother. It is here we have Blazkowicz's complete emotional breakdown. The weight on his shoulders is too much to bear, his strong exterior is completely shattered, and now he is on his knees being supported by his mother. His dialogue is much more simplistic and to the point, and Brian Bloom's fantastic performance and Machine Games' excellent animation and cinematography is one that needs to be remembered. This is Blazkowicz's inner thoughts visually realised, because this is one of the very few dream sequences in the modern franchise. But even with that knowledge, it's still one of the most wonderfully executed performances in the industry, fitting considering his execution comes shortly afterwards. This scene is a bit like the previous scene with Anya, only completely unfiltered, and starring someone more emotionally impactful to him. Its presentation isn't interrupted by absurdist situations and background chatter. It's a mother comforting her 49-year-old son, someone who lives in a world they don't recognise and is the living embodiment of hell. Pain all around him and thrusted upon him, his anxiety getting the better of him, and his mental state fully in the mire of depression. I love this scene because my personal experience with depression had this near exact moment, finally letting out what has been weighing me down, from aspects of life to the burden of guilt, to the feeling of not wanting to do anything anymore, to the fear of more oncoming hardship. I mentioned in a previous video about depression and its presentation in video games that the subject and medium have a difficulty in execution, because the games I highlighted focused on the theme of depression and not just having the element of depression, and as vague of a point that is, there's actually a very clear distinction between the two. Building the game around the theme of depression means that developers could have the best writing in the world, but the execution of the gameplay part of the game has the danger of being tonally different, and thus contradictory to story. Now, having the element of depression is different because the game isn't centered around that theme, and thus doesn't limit itself in its presentation. If Wolfenstein: The New Order and The New Colossus was about depression, then seeing things like BJ dual-wielding heavy weapons and riding mechanical monstrosities through concentration camps would be absurd for the wrong reasons, but the element of depression and how it's presented is done in such a way that it adds more weight to the levels we go through. Blazkowicz becomes a more interesting character thanks to that element, without sacrificing gameplay. The new series is the tragedy of Blazkowicz in a new era, but I have a feeling that the third game is going to have BJ having different thoughts on the situations, not because he's different, but because towards the end of the game, he lightens up. His depressing thoughts are now more factual with less of a hint of personal feelings, and he livens up due to the prospect of death no longer being a factor, thanks to the science of Futurama. He has a grand old time during his birthday without a hint of cynicism. He does let his personal feelings get the better of him one more time, but that's because part of his mission involves an audition to be a more demonized version of himself, right in front of Hitler. Pretty understandable. And hey, if you want one more crazy theory regarding Blazkowicz's contrasting mood before and after his beheading, you get the end credits music playing very differently. Don't get me wrong, the end credits music in The New Colossus is complete garbage, but it does reflect the tone of Blazkowicz's emotions.
I believe if we just
I really like the new reinvigorated Blazkowicz. Like I've said before, he's one of the best written characters in years, and that is astonishing considering the image he had before, a silent American hero whose only dialogue is that of generic responses to situations around him, now transformed into this tragic person with a lot of baggage, a harsh upbringing, newfound regret over abandoning the one person who loved him, coping with the depressing reality that he was extremely close to preventing, and finding hope in the few sane people living in an irrational world. He's also a fantastic representation of depression, and while there is a big possibility that I am seeing meaning where there is none, especially since I cannot find any verified articles or interviews that directly connect BJ to depression, is it a bad thing I am finding this? If it was an element that Machine Games deliberately put into Wolfenstein's writing direction, then they've executed it fantastically. If it wasn't, then bloody hell did they look out in creating both the best representation of it in gaming, but also send a positive message about openly talking about it.